As Thomas Jefferson pens the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, initiating the American experiment, that experiment must have seemed as improbable as it was unique. For more than just the risk of separating from the world's greatest superpower of the time, something no colony had achieved prior to that. Our founding fathers were setting an uncharted course in government. If they were that desperate, what was it that our founding fathers so desperately wanted, or alternatively, wanted to avoid, that would cause them ultimately to reject every form of government of the previous 6,000 years of human history? That seemed like a pretty good question? We'll answer that today. So how would you go about solving that? Anybody have any ideas? Well, actually, they told us. They said, you have to answer that question, here's what to do.
Do not separate text from historical background. If you do, you have perverted and subverted the Constitution, which can only end in a distorted, bastardized form of illegitimate government.
The context of history is key, and our founding fathers knew it. For example, Alexander Hamilton often employed historical references in his political arguments. Pick up the Federalist Papers, for example. He refers to the Peloponnesian Wars to punctuate his argument for a strong central government. Thomas Jefferson also demonstrated his knowledge of world and especially European history. That's why he was so well respected in the diplomatic courts of Europe. And Samuel Adams was writer for one of the two Boston newspapers of the time, often referring to the history of the divine right kings, and he reflected in his editorials his utter disgust of their oppressions. But truly, to understand the meaning of their discourse is to understand the foundations of their thinking. And to do that, we need to take a look at what they were taught, starting with the educational institutions that shaped their thinking. This is the key to understanding the world from the perspective of our founding fathers. For it was this perspective of history that our country was uniquely forged. Now, knowing what our founders knew of history may seem to be one of those impossible get inside their head questions, right? And actually, in reality, it's amazingly simple, because it lies in the influential men and the education they received as young men. Let's take a look. At that time, education and its influence was tied to the religious sentiment of the period, the origins of which most people don't understand because it's not what you'd expect. This is where we begin. The dominant religion of early New England was definitely Puritan. It spread throughout Connecticut into the mid-colonies as Calvinism. And then from there, New England church governance evolved into Congregationalists, and in the mid-colonies, Presbyterians. That's an important point. However, over time, as living conditions improved in the early 18th century, church influence waned as the population fell into indifference and apathy. In 1730, the crushing sense of sin, so real to the Puritan mind only a century before, had fallen into disfavor. It had become distasteful to many. In fact, the morality of religion had lost its power over men's lives, which it earlier possessed. In response, Jonathan Edwards and the Tennants, father and son, began to call the population and the church from its listless ways. Then, in 1739, the English evangelist George Whitefield visited America with his emotional preaching, his voice that could encompass thousands, and an oratory ability that earned Franklin's hearty respect with his vivid pictures of the sufferings of the damned. Whitefield's impact, by all accounts, was immense. He transformed religion and politics of the time as well, urging a return to religion that did not compromise with the horrors of hell, of which ignorance was much to blame. This was a different revival from the revivals that you might be more familiar with. This was a revival based on the logic and reason of the gospel message, and not just on emotional fervor alone. In fact, Franklin describes his personal experience as an objective and somewhat skeptical journalist this way. He has a loud, clear voice, articulating his words and sentences perfectly, that they may be heard at great distance. His auditories observed exact silence. And so what Franklin does, he starts walking away from Whitefield, block by block, to see if he can still hear what Whitefield is saying. He comes to the end where he's now dropping words. He says this: "I computed that he might be heard by more than 30,000 people," imagining an arc encompassing that diameter. Quote, "This reconciled me to the newspaper accounts of his having preached to 25,000 people without a microphone, which I sometimes doubted." The microphone part, by the way, was mine. Just be clear. And Franklin comments on the impact of Whitefield. Now, keep in mind that Whitefield was first permitted to preach from the pulpits. And for whatever reason, the clergy took a dislike to him. And he was obliged to preach in the fields. This isn't even a man going from church to church. He sends somebody forward that says, "I'm coming to here," either in a field or in front of a town hall, and people show up. In fact, according to Franklin, all sects, all congregations, all people, both respectable and not so respectable, show up to listen to this guy. From being thoughtless and indifferent, this is Franklin, it seems as if the whole world is growing religious, so that no one could walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families on every street. Whitefield was effective. And at the core of this revival were converts, and they were called the New Lights. And like all good Presbyterians, they wished their leaders to be saints and to become scholars. This fervor led to the founding of the College of New Jersey in 1746, an institution that we know today as Princeton. Dr. Harold Dobbs, Princeton historian, sums up the spirit of the times.
The influence of the Great Awakening extended beyond religion because of its social and political implications, which contributed to the spirit of liberty that culminated in the Declaration of Independence. The wave of revivalism emphasized freedom of conscience against both ecclesiastical and political privilege. Its outlook on religion stimulated democracy by exalting the common man through scholarship for a more democratic participation in political and social life. Dr. Harold Dobbs, historian of Princeton University.
And what was the nature of the influence that affected our founding fathers? The quintessential truth that separated them and us from the rest of human history. We'll answer that question next time on the next installment of A Heritage Lost, the American Truth.